Thomas Doyle. I'm an associate professor of political science at Texas State University. My research focus is in this interdisciplinary field called nuclear ethics, which is one part international security studies and another part is international ethics and norms. On the normative side, I'm not doing, let's say, empirical study of norms. I'm not trying to figure out in the Catherine Finnemore or Martha Finnemore, sorry, and Catherine Sickink model of norm evolution. How do norms emerge? What kind of effects do they have? For me, nuclear ethics is not just a question of the empirics, but it's also a question of how do we assess moral or ethical value on matters of international security. And so my publications have tried to explore those avenues. My first book concentrated on moral dilemmas in nuclear proliferation. And so the model that I had was a dilemma is a situation in which an actor faces either one or more requirements that are upon them that put them into conflict. I guess the most interesting moral dilemma for me is where you have a singular imperative that seems to require you to do opposing things. And security scholars oftentimes think of that as a security dilemma. But as I understand it, security is not just this rational value. I think historically, the question of existence, the question of preserving existence, preserving individual life, preserving life in society, especially national societies, it's this unspoken moral value that at least it's unspoken in the security studies community for the most part. But if you get out and you look at the discourse of society generally, it seems pretty straightforward that countries, citizens, leaders, opinion makers, they attribute moral value to the continued existence of their country. And they are feel justified in labeling countries according to ethical labels. This is a good country. This is an evil country. This is an evil leader. This is an evil regime. And a lot of times what goes on with that is policy prescriptions about what states ought to do. And when you get into that realm of what they ought to do or ought not to do, now we're talking normativity. And Michael Walzer once remarked in his book on just and unjust wars that strategy is a justificatory discourse in the same way that morality is. It's just we tend to not see strategy as having relevance. So we tend to not see morality as having relevance for strategy. But if you factor strategic questions back into the overall purpose of preserving the existence of a nation and the nation having a moral value, and my own individual existence has a moral value because of my country, and so on and so forth, then it seems like strategic questions assume a series of moral commitments. And I think those are really interesting to probe. And I think it's really interesting to understand the security dilemma as a kind of a moral dilemma. And so in my first book, I tried to do that. And I tried to show how decisions with respect to nuclear proliferation, either to pursue nuclear weapons or avoid them, or even pursue nuclear disarmament, are all wrapped up in moral dilemmas. And exactly how is that? So I tried to get as fine-grained in the analysis as I could get. In my second book, I tried to propose an ambitious nuclear ethics for the 21st century on the idea that the political conditions and the threat environments of the 21st century were different enough from the Cold War era that the nuclear ethics that were suggested for Cold War dynamics needed to be reviewed and, in my view, refined, revised. So some of the major contributors to the Cold War nuclear ethics literature were familiar scholars like Michael Walzer and Joseph Nye and a whole host of others. There was also the U.S. Catholic bishops in their pastoral letter in 1983. There in Great Britain, there was Sir Michael Quinlan, a whole range of folks, right? And their work was concentrating on nuclear issues in the context of bipolarity, in the context of a superpower ideological competition. And it looked like the 21st century, a lot of that structure had changed. We didn't have bipolarity. For a while, we had unipolarity. Now it looks like we're having multipolarity. So what does this mean for nuclear ethics? For a while, it looked like everything was being driven by ideology. Now, not so much. What does that mean for nuclear ethics? The United States and the former Soviet Union and then later the Russian Federation went through a process of dramatic nuclear reductions. Is that enough? And if it's not enough, why isn't it enough? And if you're a non-nuclear weapon state and you've been holding on to the idea that every compromise that you've made within the nuclear non-proliferation treaty regime has always had in the background this deal that they made, which is we'll put up with all these regulations and we'll put up with not ever having nuclear weapons on the condition, at least in part, that the nuclear weapon states not only negotiate towards nuclear disarmament, but actually achieve it. So if you're a non-nuclear weapon state and you're frustrated with the progress of nuclear disarmament, what are you going to do? Now, in 2015, 2017, etc., some non-nuclear weapon states, in fact, a majority, had an answer to that question. They were going to create a new treaty called the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which the nuclear weapon states and countries that are covered by nuclear security guarantees have, for the most part, resolutely committed to never signing. So we find ourselves in this position where countries aren't budging. Nuclear weapon states and their allies are not budging. Non-nuclear weapon states are not budging. Non-nuclear weapon states are trying to shame the nuclear weapon states into giving up their nuclear weapons, and the non-nuclear weapon states refuse to be shamed. And the next thing you know, we're getting increased security competition, all leading up all the way to the moment we're currently in with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the dramatic increase in the number of nuclear threats being made by Russia. And then, of course, in the background, you got the North Koreans who are constantly testing. And so it seems like we're in this place that is more dangerous than it's been in 60 years. There's a number of scholars now who are talking about we haven't had this kind of a dangerous world since the Cuban Missile Crisis in the early 1960s. So if that's the case, what does nuclear ethics have to say about that? And would anybody listen to nuclear ethical discourse? I think there's a number of people who would answer that with yes. and the way that we seem to be doing a lot of our nuclear ethics these days is through international law, like international humanitarian law or the law of armed conflict. Seeing if, as long as the nuclear weapon states keep nuclear weapons, are they willing to follow the ethical principles of just war theory as encoded in international law? So I see these as urgent questions. And I try to bring those questions into the classroom as well as into my writing. And I have an unusual career path. Since the first 20 years of my professional career, I taught high school in Los Angeles. So I have my interest in nuclear ethics started when we were doing the history of the Cold War with 10th and 11th graders. And I would, the 16 and 17 and 18-year-olds of our schools. And, you get questions about, well, what about the bombing of Hiroshima? What about the bombing of Nagasaki? What about the nuclear arms race? What about this? What about that? And in the context of the United States, since so much political discourse in the United States has moral assumptions just written all throughout. We're the leader of the free world. We're a city on a hill. We're a this, we're a that, we're the other thing. And I thought, well, it was critical for high school kids to get some kind of an idea as to what some of the moral principles were that might apply to questions of nuclear war, questions of nuclear deterrence. So when I came into the academy and got my doctoral degree out of UC Irvine, that was the project I continued with, and that's been the project that I've had until the present. That's a little bit about me.
Well, I think in that answer, you answered all the questions that I was going to ask you, actually. You've touched on what your area of expertise is, how you became interested in this area, what current issue or trend concerns you, and why the public should care. So those are the questions I was going to ask. But one more question I have, this is more in regards to your teaching, and perhaps this will be applicable to some of the lesson plans that will be published. But how do you approach teaching nuclear issues?
Well, I think for people who are new to the field, as we would expect undergraduates to be, I think the first thing to do is to induce a certain kind of emotional apprehension of the issues. So I'll show them when I'm introducing a unit on nuclear issues. I'll show them the simulations developed by Alex Wellerstein on nuclear detonations and their effects upon cities. And so this is the nuke map simulation. And I very much like this simulation because I can manipulate it in progress as I'm talking and as I'm fielding questions. So I live in Central Texas, so we'll call up maps of either Austin, Texas, or San Antonio, Texas. San Antonio is a good place because there's a lot of military bases around San Antonio, as well as a major military hospital. And then we'll drop the Hiroshima bomb on the middle of San Antonio. And just to add insult to injury, we'll drop it on the Alamo and see what happens, right? Then we'll drop a higher yield weapon. Then we'll drop a higher yield weapon. And then we'll drop a weapon that has never been tested, but of course is the one that was the largest in the Soviet design, the largest of the Tsar bombers, and see if that had been detonated, what would it look like? And it turns out that the area of destruction is just absolutely massive. And so then if we say, yeah, and then there's quite a number of those that could fall, right? It's not just one, it's several. So then I pivot to another simulation, which is the Princeton University and Department of Defense war game called Plan A. And it starts off with this single nuclear warning shot fired from Kaliningrad against NATO bases, and then a tit-for-tat response. And then we see the escalation cycle. And as the simulation plays out, we're looking at upwards of 95 million dead within 4 hours. And the complete obliteration of Europe, the complete obliteration of the United States, the near complete obliteration of Russia, and then understanding, well, now all this stuff is going up into the air, so wind, water, all that, what can we expect to happen within the next 12 months? And it's at this point, I think I've made the emotional point I want to make. And so now that I've captured everybody's attention, we start going through some of the basics that you would typically have within a lecture. But depending upon the readings that I assign, I'll structure a classroom discussion around 3, 4, maybe 5 questions. And I'll send the questions out in advance so that the students know what to prepare for when they come in to the class session. And then I'll break them up into small groups, and we'll divide the labor on the worksheet. So some group gets question 1, another group gets question 2, and so forth. And I'll give them about 10 minutes to prepare. And then we start the discussion. And I'm conscious that it's really easy to write discussion questions as if they're taking a fact recall exam, because that's the way high school does things. And it seems like people teach the way they were taught. So one of the things that has always stood out to me when I was a student is I had teachers who tried to get me to think critically. And they did not use textbooks. They did not use the worksheet format. It was more Socratic than not. But beyond just the normal, what you would expect a Socratic discussion to be, it really built into the idea that being able to recall the factual information is the necessary foundation for doing higher levels of analysis and thinking. And so just knowing your stuff isn't the end all be all of things. It's a step on the path of thinking critically about nuclear issues. All right. So, I mean, how is a student supposed to respond to the question, was the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima morally justifiable? Is it just how they feel in the moment? Or is there a systematic way of approaching the question? And if there's a systematic way of approaching the question, what's that way? And what needs to be taught so that bit by bit by bit, they have a toolkit of critical thinking skills that they can call upon. And so that's the framework, or the technical jargon, if you will. That's the scaffold that's used to structure the learning experience so that by the time you get to the analytical question, or you're asking kids for an original thought, that they're not just stumbling around, altogether lost.